Merry Christmas! I don't know if you're watching this at Christmas or if you're celebrating Christmas, but either way, I hope you're having a great time, a great week. As you can tell from the title, I'm gonna be talking about the books that I've read so far this month, and because I'm in Australia, so the books that I've read are either very summerish or Christmassy. Usually I go in chronological order, but this time I'm going to be starting with one of my favorite books of the month, of this year, and maybe of all time. And that is Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman. I cried many times reading this book, and the reason why I like it so much is not just because the writing is melancholic and poetic, but also because the main character Elio had a crush on the second main character Oliver, and it reminded me of my first ever crush. So I was 11, 12 and I had a crush on my classmate for like 3 years, but I never told him. And many little things he did and said to me made me feel that our feelings are actually mutual, but neither of us said anything. And in those 3 years, neither of us was in a relationship. So it's really a shame. Reading the first 10-20 pages really brought those years back. And I started weeping. For example, I cried when I was reading this. I'd seen my pouting apathy change into I will play anything for you till you ask me to stop, till it's time for lunch, till the skin on my fingers wears off layer after layer, because I like doing things for you. I'll do anything for you. Just say the word. I like you from day one. Oh my god. Even when you will return eyes for my renewed offers of friendship, I never forget that this conversation occurred between us and that there are easy ways to bring back summer in the snowstorm. Oh, cut the camera!
A few minutes later.
I'm back. Let's talk about the book. So the story takes place in Italy in the 80s, and we follow Elio and his family. Elio's father is a philosophy professor at a very prestigious university in the States, and every summer they have a young academic live in their house for 6 weeks, and Elio's father helped them revise their manuscripts for publication. And this summer is Oliver who's living in their house, and Elio picks him up from the local train station, I believe. And at the moment he steps out from that taxi, Elio falls in love with him. I feel like Oliver is very charismatic, very spontaneous, and a little bit offhand with the things he deals with. Whereas Elio is quiet, often misunderstood, and very knowledgeable, and he knows a lot about music and literature, and Oliver is always impressed by how much he knows. Yeah, so Elio has a crush on him on day one, but because of the way the story is narrated, you can tell very easily from the beginning that it's not going to end well. And at first I thought it was just Elio, a 17-year-old teenage boy, having a crush on Oliver, who is 24 years old, but it transpires that their feelings are mutual, and more importantly, Elio confesses his feelings to Oliver, so it becomes a heartbreaking story about yearning, love, and separation. By the way, I know their ages and age gap are kind of problematic, but the beautiful writing made me turn a blind eye to it. And the reason why I like this book so much is because so much of it is internal. It's not about things happening, but the possibility of them happening. And the writing in that sense is very exquisite and sorrowful, like the quote I read you at the beginning. There's a lot of wishful thinking, and the book is filled with so many ifs, so many should've, could've, would've, and all of them point to this incipient heartbreak, because Oliver only stays at their house for 6 weeks, and 6 weeks later Oliver and Elio are gonna part ways. And I think you really need to read the book to experience that kind of sorrow and melancholy. And there's a quote that I really liked, which I want to share with you. It's something said by Oliver's dad. "Look," he interrupted, "you had a beautiful friendship, maybe more than friendship. In my place, many parents would hope the whole thing goes away, or pray that their sons land on their feet soon enough. But I'm not such a parent. In your place, if there's pain, nurse it. And if there's a flame, don't snuff it out. Don't be brutal with it. Withdrawal can be a terrible thing when it keeps us awake at night, and watching others forget us sooner than we'd want to be forgotten is no better. We rip out so much of ourselves to be cured of things faster than we should that we go bankrupt by the age of 30 and have less to offer each time we start with someone new. But to feel nothing so as not to feel anything, what a waste. How you live your life is your business, but remember, our hearts and our bodies are given to us only once. Most of us can't help but live as though we've got 2 lives to live. One's the mock-up, the other the finished version. And then there are all those versions in between. But there's only one, and before you know it, your heart is worn out. And as for your body, there comes a point when no one looks at it, much less wants to come near it. Right now there's sorrow. I don't envy the pain. but I envy you the pain. And that is Call Me By Your Name, 5 out of 5. The next one is the first book that I read this month, The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. And it's my first Agatha Christie book. I will definitely read more of her books next year, but the main reason why I don't read a lot of murder mysteries is because I don't know if you feel the same way, but I feel really stupid reading them because I could never figure out the murderer before the end. And I had to wait for the detective to spoon feed me the answer to wow me, if that makes sense. And by the way, this book consists of 6 murder mysteries, 6 short ones, and I won't tell you any of these just so that I won't spoil the fun, but I'll read you Agatha Christie's forward just so you can have a taste of it. This book of Christmas fare may be described as the chef selection. I am the chef. There are 2 main courses, The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and The Mystery of the Spanish Chest. A selection of entrees, Greenshaw's Folly, The Dream, and The Underdog. And a sorbet, 4 and 20 blackbirds. I think it's really ingenious to describe your works as courses of a meal. Okay, so that is The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. I gave it 4 out of 5. Okay, I had to change rooms because there's construction going on the other side of the apartment and it looks like it's not gonna stop anytime soon. And then I read A Pale View of Heels, which is the debut novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, who is the winner of the Nobel Prize in 2017. After reading it, I can kind of understand why this is his least liked book, but as a debut novel, I think it's great because it tells you what kind of writer Ishiguro is and his writing style. So I think I will tell you a little bit about Kazuo Ishiguro himself. Kind of random, but it's history class time. Pay attention. So Ishiguro was born in Nagasaki, which is one of the 2 nuclear bombing sites in Japan in World War II. And he and his family immigrated to the UK when he was only 5. Although in this book, half the story takes place in Nagasaki, Ishiguro said that he had never been to Japan or his hometown till 1989, which is 7 years after this novel had been published. So what he had in mind when he was creating this novel is an imaginary Japan. He had all the image built up in his head. So this book is titled A Pale View of Heels, and as I read the book, I could definitely see what kind of image he was trying to paint. It's like the painting by Monet. I liked his writing most of the time, but some of the characters are so nasty and it was unbearable for me to read when one of them drowned cats. Okay, let's move on to the story. The story is about a Japanese woman called Etsuko who lives in the UK and she has 2 daughters. One of them is called Keiko and she recently committed suicide in her apartment in Manchester. And the second one is called Nikki, who has come from London to visit her mum. Her daughters are half-sisters. Nikki is her second child with an Englishman and Keiko a Japanese. Nikki asks her mum what her life was like before she came to the UK, and Etsuko starts to relate to the reader her life back in Nagasaki, Japan when the Second World War just ended. In particular, she recounts her life in the summer when she meets a woman called Sachiko, who is a very irresponsible mother of a child that is no more than 80 years old. So the woman called Sachiko seems to be dating an American sailor and she sees him as her savior who can rescue her out of an impoverished life in Japan because she married into a highly respected family before the war, but then the war had changed everything. She has an ungrounded trust in this American guy even though he has betrayed her several times. She is also naively optimistic about her life in America, and even though she has relatives in Japan who live in a mansion and welcome her to live with them, she still chooses her American boyfriend. Also, her daughter is very strange and sulky and sullen all the time, but she somehow believes that after moving to the States, her daughter is gonna stop behaving this way. I feel like this is where the book starts to get interesting because it deals with the post-war ideologies in Japan. Because Japan, as a country that had lost the war, gradually started to take in the technologies and ideologies from the West. And some people are very pro-Westernization, other people are against it, like the author Yukio Mishima. But I think it's a shame that the author didn't kind of, dive deep into this topic. So back to the book. The narrative shifts between the past and the present, Japan and the UK, and overall I think it just sounds very cryptic. And also I think because she is trying to recall something happened 20 years ago, the credibility of the narrator is also questionable. So here's my interpretation of the book, or my take of this mysterious woman called Sachiko who seems to appear out of nowhere, which you may or may not want to skip ahead because technically I'm not giving anything away, but if you want to read it and think about it yourself first, then please skip this. So I'm gonna draw a relationship map first actually because I think the names are confusing. Okay. So my theory is that Etsuko and Sachiko are the same person, and Mariko and Keiko are the same person, because many details in the book seem to suggest that this is the case. The two most obvious similarities they share are that both Mariko and Keiko seem to be unhappy about their life or their future life in the West, as in the UK and the US. In Mariko's case, she detests her mom's boyfriend, and in Keiko's case, she committed suicide. And second, both Sachiko and Etsuko leave their previous lives behind. In Sachiko's case, she decides to go with an American boyfriend instead of, staying with her family. And in Etsuko's case, she leaves her Japanese husband, although it was never explained why that was the case. And I think the most obvious giveaway in this book was this quote. Memory, I realized, can be an unreliable thing. Often it is heavily colored by the circumstances in which one remembers, and no doubt this applies to certain of the recollections I have gathered here. So what I believe is that Etsuko thinks that she's a terrible mom and she has done something horrible and very cruel to her daughter, and she can't forgive herself. And Sachiko is a product of her imagination. So yeah, I gave this book 3 out of 5. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a great book, but still I think there are many themes that can be further explored, and the narrative is just too cryptic. So yeah, that's a pale view of Heels. And then I read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which is festive and didactic, and it's an allegory for what happens to those who are unnecessarily twisted and bitter and refusing to take part in joyful occasions. This is actually my first time reading this book because my younger self couldn't care less about reading. But now that I've read it, I can tell you a little bit about the story. So in this book, it follows Scrooge, who is a misanthropic businessman and a miser. On Christmas Eve, he encounters Marley, who was also a miser and died 7 years ago. Marley's ghost tells Scrooge that he'd better change up or he's gonna end up like himself, a ghost chained to the earth. So with the help of Marley, Scrooge is haunted by 3 ghosts. The ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. And he sees what he will end up like if he continues to be such a bitter and greedy person, and he decides to change for good. End of story. I feel like I made it sound very lame, but trust me, it is so lovely, and I love Charles Dickens' writing. And here's a sentence about onions. Just imagine being able to write about onions like this. They were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung up mistletoe. I will definitely read this book every Christmas from now on. The 5th book, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, is the epitome of no plots, just vibes, but good vibes. And it's really fitting for Christmas because it's a fantasy and the story is a wonderland and many people liked it. But what about me?
I'll tell you later.
So, The Night Circus is about a traveling circus that arrives without warning. All of a sudden, it's there when before it wasn't. The circus opens at midnight and closes at dawn. Inside the circus, there are multiple different tents. For example, in one tent there's a contortionist, in another there's a fortune teller. And our protagonist is an illusionist / magician called Celia, and she does real magic, not just a bunch of misdirections. And as we'll learn later in the book, the circus is not just a circus. It serves as a venue for the competition between 2 young magicians, Celia and another guy called Marco. They are brought up by different magicians for this magical contest, but they're not told who their opponents are, what this contest is about, and how they're going to be judged on. So they need to figure out everything on their own. And one spoiler alert, one of them is gonna die. In this book, you also follow a bunch of other characters around the circus. Each of them has their own interesting stories, and these stories interweave. We also jump around in time a lot. But at its core, it's super magical, super enchanting, and dazzling. I was really mesmerized by this book, and I devoured the first 300 pages in one day, which is about half of the book. But here comes the but. I really thought I was gonna like this book, but towards the end, I was slightly disappointed because I didn't see any, one-on-one competition between the 2 magicians, because that was what I signed up for. Like, I was expecting something darker and more sinister, but the way a story evolves is very mellow and lukewarm, if that makes sense. And essentially what these 2 magicians do as a way of competition is to add new elements to the circus, like making a new tent in a very creative way using their magic. And the competition kind of burns away slowly over the course of 3 or 4 years. So the second part was a bit of a letdown for me, I'm not gonna lie. I gave it 3.5 stars, but I just want to say, just because I was slightly disappointed in this book doesn't mean you won't enjoy it either. And also because there are so many people who like this book and said that it was one of their favorite books. So if you're looking for some kind of escapism, definitely give it a try. The last book is Emma by Jane Austen, which I just finished reading yesterday at 8 p.m. and I gave it 4 out of 5. I think it's hilarious and brilliant, and I had a good laugh reading it, especially in the scene where, you know, on Christmas Eve, Mr. Elton was making violent love to Emma Woodhouse, our heroine, on their carriage back home. And after the violent lovemaking, their conversation gets really awkward, and Jane Austen describes the awkwardness between them as zigzags of embarrassment. I think it's ingenious. And Mr. Woodhouse, charming Mr. Woodhouse. I've read 3 Jane Austen books so far, Pride and Prejudice, Persuasion, and this one, and Mr. Woodhouse is my favourite Jane Austen hero so far. I'll get to him later. In this book, we follow Emma Woodhouse, our heroine, who is a self-proclaimed matchmaker. She has made a match between her governess and Mr. Weston, and now she takes this pretty girl called Harriet Smith on her wing, and she wants to make her impressive match with the vicar. And swept away by Emma's excessive praise, Harriet turns down the marriage proposal from a farmer because Emma insinuated that he is not good enough for her, whereas in fact the farmer is very good-hearted and quietly prosperous. And then the vicar turns out to be horrified at Emma's idea, and Harriet has her heart broken. And this is just the beginning of a series of Emma's blunders. And from her mistakes, any reader can tell that she is very snobbish, vain, and thinks too well of herself. She believes that she knows perfectly well what other people think and feel, and that she is helping them, whereas in fact she's just messing around. But here's the point. The brilliance of this novel is that for such an exasperating and obnoxious character like Emma, you will actually willingly forgive her and even like her towards the end. I detested Emma at the beginning, and the first time I read this book, which was 5 years ago, I couldn't even finish the book because of how annoying she is. But this time I finished it, and you know what? I understand her and I empathize with her. And rather unsurprisingly, Emma ends up marrying Mr. Knightley, who is 17 years her senior. Mr. Knightley is sensible, perceptive, understanding. He's basically anything Emma is not. He's a true gentleman. He watches Emma growing up, and he is the only one who can see the faults in Emma's character and enjoys correcting her. He has been in love with Emma for almost 8 years before he confesses his feelings towards her. And the famous line he said was probably, "If I love you less, I might be able to talk about it more." Oh my god, I think they're perfect for each other. But the reason why this book is not a 5-star for me is because some part of the book is hard to get through. Like, I couldn't care less about what the characters are saying sometimes, and I had to power through them. For example, Miss Bates. Like, she talks a great deal, and by a great deal, I mean an entire page, if not a page and a half. Like, for example here, can you see that? Can you see this square bracket and this square bracket? It's just all her talking, my goodness. Like, I understand she's that kind of character, but each time I saw her name and she started speaking, some part of me just shriveled up inside. Here's a bonus, The Polar Express. It's a picture book and I read it every Christmas. Also, it doesn't snow in where I live, so I have to live vicariously through this book. Alright, here's all I have. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Also, Merry Christmas. Bye!